Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
So what we're doing here is a little different. We're going to crack open Ray Dalio's book, The Changing World Order, but not as a summary and definitely not as advice. Instead, we're treating it as a systems model, a machine for understanding how empires rise and, well, how they fall.
And we're going to follow a really clear path. First, we'll nail down the system itself, what Dalio calls the big cycle. Then, we'll look at what makes it go, the incentives. From there, we'll check out the predictable results, figure out why this pattern keeps repeating, and finally connect it all to the bigger picture of the world order.
All right, first things first, let's get really clear on the system we're actually talking about. What in the world is the big cycle?
You know, at its core, the big cycle is this pattern that you see over and over again in history. A country or an empire gets its start, it rises up, usually because it's super productive and innovative. But then, over time, as it gets to the top, it starts to take on huge amounts of debt and gets torn apart by fighting from within. And that, right there, leads to its decline. And this chart here, it basically lays out the whole story. The rise on the left is driven by things like good education, strong character, and smart innovation. But once an empire hits its peak, you see the shift. It gets overextended, it stops being as competitive, and the debt just balloons. The key takeaway is that the internal rot is just as crucial as any threat from the outside. Okay, so that's the what. But what about the why? What is the engine that actually drives this cycle forward? What are the incentives that seem to push even the mightiest nations down the same old path? Well, it really boils down to three big things. First, debt and politics. Let's be honest, it's almost always more popular for politicians to spend money, even money they don't have, than it is to save it. Second, there's the reserve currency. When you're the top dog, the whole world uses your money. That gives you this incredible ability to borrow, but it also puts your economy under some seriously weird pressures. And third, inequality. Over time, the money just flows to the top, creating these massive wealth gaps that pour gasoline on the fire of political conflict. And Dalio really just hits the nail on the head here. He points out that when things are good, those huge wealth gaps might not cause a crisis. But the second the economy takes a nosedive, suddenly everyone is fighting tooth and nail over a much smaller pie. That conflict is a huge driver of the system's breakdown. So you've got this system, right? And it's humming along, driven by these really powerful incentives. So what happens next? What are the results we can actually expect to see time and time again? And what's kind of wild is that the outcomes are incredibly consistent throughout history. Those wealth gaps we talked about, they get wider. The political landscape becomes a battlefield, totally polarized. The money system starts to get shaky with debt crises and inflation. And on the world stage, you start to see new challengers rise up to take on the old dominant power. These aren't just random chaotic events. They're the predictable outputs of the system doing its thing. You can literally see this progression mapped out here on the internal cycle. It kicks off with bubbles and big wealth gaps in stage 4. That leads to really bad conflicts, fighting over wealth and power in stage 5. And if it gets bad enough, it can end in revolutions or even civil war in stage 6. It's a clear, and frankly, kind of scary, downhill slide.
This all begs a huge question, right? If this pattern is so predictable, why on earth does it just keep happening over and over? To really get our heads around that, we're going to use a really powerful metaphor.
Okay, so picture this. The entire world order is like a giant, heavy, slowly rotating balance wheel. Just hold that image in your mind. Here's how it works. When wealth, power, and debt are spread out pretty evenly, the wheel spins smoothly. You get peace, you get stability. But as the big cycle moves along, all that weight, think of it as massive debt and super concentrated wealth, starts piling up on just one side of the wheel. And what happens then? It starts to wobble. And that wobble, that's the instability. That's the political conflict. That's the feeling that things are coming apart. And this right here, this is the crisis in perception. We all see the surface level stuff, the political shouting matches, the culture wars, the daily chaos. We see the wobble, but we often completely miss the real cause, which is the deep underlying imbalance in the money and power structure that's throwing the whole wheel off balance. And worse, short-term politics actually rewards leaders for just piling more weight onto the heavy side, making the wobble worse while hoping it doesn't fall apart on their watch. All right, to bring this all home, let's just pull the camera back one last time and see how this big cycle, this wobbly wheel, plugs into the entire global system. You see, the big cycle isn't happening in some kind of bubble. Its ups and downs literally define the entire world we live in.
It shapes the rules of who trades with whom, the stability of the entire financial system built around that one reserve currency, and it even affects whether people trust big international institutions like the UN or the World Bank. When the cycle shifts, everything shifts with it.
So we're left with this one final really important question. If this model is a good guide, if these patterns from history really do repeat, what does this whole system, the cycle, the incentives, the predictable results, what does it tell us about where we are right now in this moment?
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a longer audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.